Hi, everyone. This is Jackson Steger, and you're listening to Season 2 of Campfire. Let's get it. Whereas Season 1 focused on the tips, tricks, and tactics that decentralized organizations use to achieve ambitious goals, Season 2 offers us an opportunity to focus on Cabin's own ambitious goal, which is building a new kind of city. Throughout these next 12 episodes, we'll be studying the frameworks and the playbooks that other projects adjacent to city building have tried or learned from. And our first guest is none other than Cabin City Council member Phil Levin, who may join us as a recurring character on and off throughout the season. And Phil's had an absolutely legendary career. After stints in each of consulting, banking, and Facebook, he shifted his focus to launching and supporting businesses and social experiments that make radically new ways of living possible. So think remote work, new cities, co-living, digital nomadism, off-grid living, van life, all that fun stuff. So before he was leading Cabin's placemaking efforts, Phil was most recently on the founding team of Culdesac, a new car-free mega development in Arizona, which we talk about the origin story of, the challenges they faced, and so much more at the start of the episode. He's also been an inspiration to me with his leadership and ongoing residency in a number of different Californian co-living projects, which we also discuss best practices and other details for. Last, but certainly not least, he's an advisor to KIFT, and on deck, he's creator of a consulting firm called 99 Miles Per Hour that prepares leaders for a shifting mobility paradigm, and he's author of Super Nuclear, which is a co-living newsletter that I was subscribed to long before I met him. Global forces like the pandemic and remote work are leading to a major shift in how we live, how we do our jobs, how we make friends, how we find belonging. And Phil is one of the foremost thought leaders in this space. So I was thrilled to record this episode with him. I hope he comes back soon. Enough teasing. We'll get to the episode now. Thank you all so much for coming back to a second season. Thanks to the Cabin and the podcast team for helping us get back up and running. The episodes are now also available on YouTube for those of you who would prefer to watch video. And yeah, without further ado, here's the episode. Thanks for listening. Phil Levin, welcome to Campfire.
Thank you, Jackson. It's great to be here.
Really excited to have you as we transition the podcast from less of a focus on how decentralized communities achieve wildly ambitious goals to how cities are born and made. And you have this awesome storied career, which we're going to get into, that concerns place in a lot of different shape and ways. But before we talk about Culdesac or Radish or any of the other number of projects that you've been involved with before Cabin, I just want to ask like this kind of big conceptual question, which is, why should humans even consider building new cities and not just improving the ones that we already have?
Yeah. We do have a lot of great cities. So I understand that impulse to sort of rest on our laurels. But, I think, what sort of like drives me is sort of the idea that maybe we can do better. Maybe there's a better city out there that we haven't built yet. And sort of dreaming of that is one of the things that motivates me every day. But I think, one thing I think to consider, especially when we talk about American cities, is sort of two facts about American cities. So one is that most of them were sort of built around the private automobile as sort of its like main design criteria. How do we move and how do we store cars? It really determines much of the shape of our cities. And I think we're entering a new era in transportation where the sort of one car per person paradigm is coming to an end. And you're starting to see this with all the on-demand mobility services like bike share and scooter share and Uber and Lyft and Getaround are sort of reducing the need for everyone to have their own car. But I really think the big transformational thing is going to be self-driving cars. And you think of how much like cars influence our cities, think about how self-driving cars are going to influence our cities, and it's going to be probably equally important. One answer is there's sort of new inputs into like what we can do and how we can design our places. But I think the second thing to think about is we really haven't built a lot of new cities in America lately. So if you look at our 10 most populous cities in the United States, the two youngest are Dallas and Phoenix. They were founded over 150 years ago. Wow. And when you think what was around 150 years ago, I mean, there was no electricity 150 years ago. I don't think there was really plumbing 150 years ago. So like a lot of the assumptions that sort of went into like how you design a city in our big cities are like extremely antiquated. And I think we're sort of at a moment now where there's enough sort of new phenomenon in the world where we might be able to imagine new, better, different places. And so I think we're in an interesting moment in time where we can actually dream about new places, and maybe we couldn't do that 50 years ago.
Yeah, I appreciate that answer. I want to go back to what you were saying about self-driving cars and how they do change the way that we interact with our cities. So I'd be curious, like how, I guess the first part of the question is, how do self-driving cars change how we might connect with our cities? But then the second piece is, like, how are human behavior and city design interconnected more broadly, thinking about like just regular cars or planes, or if we were to get around on bikes or just pedestrian cities?
Yeah, totally. So I recently did a really cool hike in San Francisco, which I'd recommend to any of your Bay Area listeners. It's called the Crosstown Trail in San Francisco. It starts in one corner of San Francisco and ends in the other corner. It's 17 miles of hiking through the city, and like takes you through a bunch of neighborhoods you may have never visited before. I sort of fell in love with San Francisco again after doing this.
Sure.
But what's sort of cool about that experience is like you walk it in one direction and you drive it back in the other direction. And you get to like sort of sit there in the car and reflect on how different your experience of San Francisco was in sort of these two modes. And I think what it really comes down to is like how you conceive of other people walking versus in your car. So when you're walking, people are like the highlight. They're people watching. We have this term people watching. They are like, they're the things that give the place life is other people. You want other people on the street when you're on foot. When you're in your car, it's the opposite. People are a nuisance. They're traffic. They're like taking your parking spaces. They're in your way. You're waiting for them. People are like, get out of my way, people. And I think sort of this like mental model of how you see others in your city is actually very linked to your mode of transit. And our car cities are very depersonalized places. And our pedestrian cities are places where you sort of breathe in and like live the people around you. And so for me, this is like a very sort of fundamental thing. And so I think, in a very roundabout way of answering this, I think when we think about self-driving cars, it's probably going to turbocharge a lot of the things that like sort of cars did to our cities. And so like, you might be going point A to point B with a VR headset, and not even like looking out the window and like understanding what you're passing as you go. We may be like disembodying our cities and the people in them with self-driving cars. And so I think it's like really important from a policy and business perspective, how we sort of think about how we're going to respond to this oncoming new technology, which in itself is sort of neutral, but it's the policies that are really going to shape how it comes to be in our cities. And I think we should like take the lessons from cars and make sure we don't make the same mistakes that we did with a private car.
I'm glad you brought up mistakes with cars and San Francisco in the same answer, because in April you tweeted this like really stark image of two different plots of, I think it was 485 square feet, and in the plot on the left was like a decent sized, tight but cozy 1-bedroom apartment with its own living room and kitchen area, and then the other 485 square foot plot was like a parking space and a half and like a little walking room. And your caption highlighted that San Francisco has 442,000 public parking spaces and yet only 22,000 affordable housing units. So what are those lessons that we can learn from cars? Like, what kind of choice are we making when we design our cities like this?
Yeah. I mean, I think unconsciously we gave away our entire cities to automobiles. And so in San Francisco, the crazy stat is that the on-street parking, so just like the cars parked on the side of the street, if you take their surface area, it's bigger than Golden Gate Park, which is sort of our main park in San Francisco. And so like we are making choices in our cities about how to use our scarce space. And we are prioritizing sort of our storage of automobiles and movement of automobiles over all other things we might do with public space. And I think when we think about policies around self-driving cars, this is sort of one of the first places I would look, is like, how we design policy to make sure public space is used in ways that we want. And I think the thing that people talk about, and if you haven't read Donald Shoup, he's sort of the like Yoda of this. He wrote a book called the High Cost of Free Parking. We've basically made all uses of cars free, and so people have gotten addicted to the freeness of driving and parking and moving cars, and it's hard to compete with free if you're any alternative to that.
So with that answer comes this implication, which I agree with, but I just want to talk about it for a second, that if given the choice, we might actually prefer communities where we don't have to lean so much on cars. And there's this tweet that I know you've seen and circulated as well, but this idea that Americans love the college experience because it's the only time in their lives that they live in walkable communities. So yeah, just based on what you've seen, is that true? Is that what people want?
I think it is. So there's a stat we quoted a lot at Culdesac, which I know we'll talk about in a bit, where there's a survey that asked Americans if they want to live in walkable neighborhoods, and not surprisingly, the majority of Americans want to live in walkable neighborhoods. But then we did an analysis on how many Americans actually do live in walkable neighborhoods, based on the walk scores of where they live. And we were pretty generous with the walk score. It actually, we took like 70 or above, which is actually not even that walkable. So the stat is that only 8% of Americans actually live in walkable neighborhoods. And so there's a sort of like yawning gap between people's express preference and like where they actually get to live. And it's really an issue of the supply of walkable neighborhoods. There's just not that many walkable places in the United States, and people want more of them, but they're really hard to build.
So given that, I think great segue opportunity. Could you explain to the audience what Culdesac was, and then also what your role was at a high level, and then we'll get into some of the specifics.
Yeah, sure. So along with two guys named Ryan Johnson and Jeff Behrens, I sort of was one of the founding team members of Culdesac, which is we call ourselves a post-car real estate developer. And we are building the first walkable car-free cities in the United States, car-free neighborhoods in the United States, I should say. And so Culdesac's first development is in Tempe, Arizona. It's going to house 1,000 people. And so it's a 17-acre mixed-use walkable neighborhood with 0 square feet of asphalt. And so the residents do not have their own parking spaces, and rely instead on sort of this like cocktail of on-demand mobility services and public transit. It's right on a public transit stop, right on a light rail stop in Tempe. And the neighborhood is mixed use. So there's a grocery store inside the neighborhood. There's restaurants, bars, etc. inside the neighborhood. So we're sort of trying to build walkability into a place that traditionally has not been seen as very walkable, which is the Phoenix metro area.
And so if I was living in Culdesac and I wanted to go back to Los Angeles to visit a friend, and for whatever reason I wanted to drive, like how would I do that if I didn't have a car living at Culdesac?
How did you get to the airport last time you went to the airport, Jackson?
I Ubered, Phil.
Yep. So that's sort of the answer. And so there's basically a new set of mobility services that didn't exist a decade ago. Actually, Uber probably did, but close to a decade ago. Mm-hmm. They actually make it possible for people like you and me to live without a car. And so in Culdesac, if you're going to the airport, it might be actually taking the light rail, which goes to the airport from Culdesac. And it's actually a very smooth, easy journey. Or you could take an Uber if you wanted to do that. Or you could go to the parking lot, and we actually have car shares in a small parking lot on the side, but they're not private cars. It's sort of a small fleet of cars that you can rent by the hour or by the day for needs that come up like that.
So I love all of this. Just as a quick aside from the questions, I have never owned a car. I don't really intend to. I bike to and from the WeWork every day. A bike has been my primary form of transportation since college. Before that, I took a bus. And just the idea of like making something like Culdesac a reality is so cool to me. And I remember first hearing about it before you and I knew each other. And I like did a demo or just a call with someone on the Culdesac team and got really excited. But for a while, until it existed, I never imagined that it might, because development in America is such a tricky process. And I'm curious, I'm sure that when you and the rest of the team were first embarking on this journey, that there were a large number of challenges. What were like the 3 or 4 biggest hurdles that you saw before you had any sort of certainty that this project would actually be brought all the way to fruition?
Yeah. First of all, Jackson, I want to give you props for being a car-free resident of Los Angeles, and being a biker. And actually, Culdesac sends people stickers that say car-free since X number of years if they've been car-free for a certain number of years. So we're going to figure out a way to get you a sticker.
Love it.
But yeah, so you sort of asked, like, what were sort of the big challenges in bringing something like Culdesac to life? Yeah, so if I was going to sort of list them off, number one would be finding a piece of land that's big enough to sort of have a neighborhood that's sizable enough that it can be its own walkable community. So it's very easy to find a huge piece of land, out in the wilderness. It's very hard to find a huge piece of land in the middle of a city, next to public transit, which is really important for us. And so we had to look pretty far and wide to find a piece of land. We found a perfect piece of land in Tempe, and we're very lucky to find it, 17 acres. So that was sort of the first big challenge. The second big challenge, and maybe one that we'll probably chat about, is regulation. And so, for a long time, basically in every city in the United States, we sort of have regulated the necessity of car infrastructure into our developments. So most cities in the U.S. have minimum parking requirements. So each housing unit will say we have to have 1 parking space or even 2 parking spaces per unit or per bedroom. It is sort of a common thing you'll see in a lot of code in cities. And so we are going to need a variance from the established regulation to build Culdesac, which is a whole process that needs to go through the city council and the city of Tempe. And we managed to do, and Tempe was great to work with on this. The third thing is money. So a typical sort of software tech startup will say, I need some seed funding to do my MVP. And what they usually mean by this is I need maybe $500,000, $1 million, a few $1 million, and then I get my software product out there and I get to see if it works. Culdesac's MVP happened to be $200 million, which is sort of a 1,000-person walkable neighborhood, which we sort of thought was the smallest size that you could really have a cohesive feeling of community and sort of enough density to support the things we want to support there.
Why is that the minimally viable size?
Yeah, so the mixed use piece was really important for Culdesac. And so if you're going to have a walkable neighborhood, it's really important that you have things like a grocery store in your neighborhood. You can't have a grocery store for a 10-unit apartment building. The economics of that just don't work out. And so you sort of need a certain scale to support these things and support also amenities like pools and parks and everything else. We can have nice things in the society if there's enough people to sort of use them where the cost of building them makes sense. And so that applies to a development like this as well. And so we sort of thought 1,000 was a good size. Future cul-de-sacs will be bigger than 1,000 people, but that was sort of our minimum viable neighborhood.
Gotcha. So that's land, regulation, money, and was there any fourth major challenge that you saw?
Oh yes, demand, proving demand. So we knew there'd be demand for this. We knew everyone wanted this, and I think a lot of people knew that intrinsically. But you sort of have to prove to people that are going to support your project that there's going to be demand for this thing. And when you're building the first type of a thing that's ever existed before, it's hard to prove that there's going to be demand for it because there's no examples. It's also hard to you need to convince people to sign leases who've never seen the thing before. And so we put a whole lot of effort into outreach into communities that we thought would be interested in living in a place like Culdesac, and sort of getting a lot of groundswell before it opened. And so we had more deposits than spaces for Culdesac pretty early on in the process, and that proof of demand sort of helped us show all the parties we needed to show this is possible, that it is possible and people want to live there, and that that not having cars is actually seen as a positive by a lot of people and not a negative.
So I want to spend 5 minutes-ish going into each of those challenges and how you overcame them. So starting with just land, to this point of you need a like really decently sized plot of land, but like also not in the middle of nowhere. You found one in the middle of a like growing city in Arizona. Like how?
We sort of went to a few cities we thought might be good, and we got on scooters, like Lime scooters, and like scooted around and like tried to live the car-free life in the places. And like you really learn what a place is like without a car if you're sort of living on a scooter. And so we would scooter all these like plots of land that were being sold, and just like, how does it feel to get there? How does it feel to get from the train station to the place on a scooter? And so that was sort of our like experience of finding a place, was like sort of seeing it from the eyes of our future residents without a car.
Yeah, shout out to scooters, because I mean you like gave me props for living in Los Angeles for like without a car. I push back on that a little. I don't see myself as living in Los Angeles. I live in Venice. I have used scooters and my bike to get around, but I have probably left the neighborhood of like Venice and Santa Monica a total of like 3 times, twice to go to the airport and once to go to a Lakers game. So scooters are great. It seems as though you found like just the right piece of land, but then just by chance, or
Yeah. Wait, Jackson, we got to talk about your biking. So I understand you have a bike, but you don't have an e-bike.
Yeah, I'm trying to get my
right?
workouts in. Yes.
Okay. As the primary car-free ambassador of this podcast, I'm gonna demand you get an e-bike. These e-bikes have completely changed the game on how people can get around cities in a like fun, comfortable way. And I know you got to get your workouts in, but for the rest of us, e-bikes are really changing the car-free game. And the Culdesac team is huge on e-bikes. Ryan, the CEO of Culdesac, owns like dozens of them. And he's happy to lend them out. So we gotta get you fitted.
So that's land. Coming to then like the regulation piece. How do you convince? Because there's this comment you made. I'm not sure if it was on a cabin call or maybe when I was with you in person, but that like doing cool development in America is really hard. And so I guess I'm curious, like, why is that? And what did you do to make a cool development like Culdesac possible?
Totally. So Jackson, if you think about like your favorite cities in the world and your favorite neighborhoods in your favorite cities, basically all those places are illegal to build now. So we've made it really easy to build the things that we don't like, or at least I don't like. I won't speak for everyone else. Mm-hmm. But sort of these like unsustainable, isolated places. We've made those extremely easy to build. And we made the places that we sort of think of as like the culture and heartbeat of our cities really hard to build. And so not surprisingly, the output we get from that is we get a lot of the thing we don't want, and we get very little of the thing we do want. So it, I think there's like a lot of ways to answer this, and zoning is very local, but like, I think conceptually, the sort of typical attitude towards zoning in cities is cities will basically like whitelist a handful of things that you're allowed to do, the kinds of development that are sort of almost like pre-approved. They're like things you're like allowed to build without much hassle. And usually like big single family mansions are like always on that list in most places of things that you can sort of build without much hassle. So that's like the whitelist approach. It's like, here's like the 10 things you're allowed to build. There's this example in Japan where they actually take a very different approach, and it's more of a blacklist approach, where it's like, you can build almost whatever you want, but here's things we don't want. So we don't want like a factory next to a school. And then there's like a public reason you might not want that. But we're not going to like say up front, like, here's the only things you can do. And I would like actually love to see more places take more of a blacklist approach of like preventing harm than a whitelist approach of sort of constraining development to like a few forms that people think are like okay to build. Because it really does stifle sort of innovation, creativity, and really sort of stifles like all the things that have made all our favorite places the place we want to be.
Really appreciate that answer. Moving now to money, I'm curious, like $200 million of a seed round is like a lot. And I get this sense that you and the rest of the Culdesac team have this almost like tech background, and yet you're coming into this like real estate space. And so I'm curious, kind of a two-part question, like what are some of the challenges for raising large amounts of money for a new type of development? And then how are real estate investors different from venture capitalists?
So I'll just clarify that the $200 million is not our seed round. The $200 million is the total capital that Culdesac sort of raised over time to build the first development. So the challenges in raising that amount of money from anyone is just a large amount of money for something that's never been done before, and so it's sort of the base challenge. But I think what Culdesac sort of managed to do, and I think a lot of this owes to the fact that Ryan, who founded it, came from the tech and the real estate industry. So he was one of the founding team members at Open Door, which sort of, I think, pioneered this model of how can you do heavy capital sort of technology companies and do it in a way that makes both the VC investors happy, but also sort of the real estate investors happy as well. There's sort of just different preferences on risk reward amongst these two kinds of investors. And so, VCs want to see the possibility of making many multiples on their money. So they're okay if you fail, but they're not okay if the thing, only doubles in value. They want to see it increase in value much, much more than that. Whereas real estate investors typically, I think want to typically see more predictable, consistent returns. And so the question is how do you basically create a structure which allows the tech people to get exposure to the high risk stuff, which is what they want, and the real estate people to get exposure to lower risk stuff as well. And I think it's sort of, and so sort of telling the right story and creating the right structures for both parties is a tricky game, and something that we sort of spend a lot of time doing in Culdesac. And I think it's going to be key to anyone who wants to play in the physical world.
I bet. The last challenge that we talked about was proving demand, which I'll come back to, but I think I'm going to wait until we talk about Cabin a little bit more in a second here, and then tie those two together. So just a few last Culdesac questions before we transition here. Culdesac started off as this crazy idea, but it was just in the idea stage, and you and the team faced so many uphill battles just to get it greenlit for development, whether it's the regulation, the demand generation, which we're still going to talk about in a little bit. But what is it about the team, Ryan, and anyone else that you worked with in those early formative moments that made the team so able to persist and run through walls to make it happen?
I think it was taking sort of the tech industry approach to what typically was a real estate problem. I think when people think about tech companies, they often think about code and software. And Culdesac is actually developing quite a bit of software as well. But I think it's also just a sort of the spirit of how you sort of move fast and execute is a lot of what makes tech companies organizationally successful. And the one thing I will say about the Culdesac team is they are relentlessly good, focused executors. And this whole thing, this building the first car-free neighborhood in America is not an easy problem. And people have tried to do this before. I think it really takes a lot of focused execution to actually get it done, and really knowing what you want to get done and being very clear about it.
Yeah, I think that a lot of this season of the podcast is going to be focused on how to find that focused execution and see it all the way through. So I appreciate you sharing kind of the early founding story of Culdesac with us. I want to transition now to some of the co-living and communal living projects that you've been involved in for several reasons. One, because I think it helps us get closer from Culdesac to Cabin, but two, because like you, I've done a lot of co-living and communal living projects, especially in the last 2 years, and it's just been one of the most fulfilling experiences of my life. And I think that you and I owe it to others who haven't tried it yet to convince them as to why they should. But before we talk about the actual co-living piece, I want to talk in the same way we did in Culdesac about place. I want to talk about behavioral economics and just human behavior. And your partner, Kristen, who helped to co-found Irrational Labs with Dan Ariely. I'm curious, one of the oldest tricks in the behavioral economics textbook is that, what would you say?
Yeah, so I'm cribbing from Kristen's notes here. My partner, who's a behavioral scientist who We just had our first kid, and we sort of have done these communal living projects together. But she would say the oldest trick in the behavioral science book is like surrounding yourself with people that you love and admire and make yourself the best version of yourself. And so, like, the sort of theory behind behavioral economics is that our environment has a profound influence on our behavior. And that if you want to behave a certain way, the like number one thing you should do is make it so that your environment sort of forces you to behave that way. It's not about willpower. Kristen's very anti-willpower. She doesn't think willpower actually exists. She thinks you have to basically make it easy on yourself. And so, if the things you want in your life is you want to be, inspired, happy, joyous, well-fed, putting yourself around people who will basically just bring that into your life as a course of their just like daily behavior, because they're around you, is like the easiest way to do that. And so we made the decision early on in our relationship, back when we were having the like, should we move in together conversation, that like we were always going to live with people, and we were always going to design our living situation around people. And it's never been easy. It's like always a lot of work, but I think it's been like the highest ROI work I've done in my personal life, has been like choosing to like really design my environment around people I adore, and like making it so that I can get as much of them as possible in my daily life.
I would agree. I think this idea that you're the average of the 5 or 10 people you spend the most time with is extremely accurate. And like to that end, have made intentional decisions in my life to live with ambitious or hardworking or fitness-oriented folks, such that I like via osmosis gain those qualities too. So I'm curious, as you've built some of these co-living projects, and I want to talk about them, if we take everything we're saying to heart, how would you design a living environment? And maybe answer that with brief descriptions of each of RGB, Radish, and Cloudside.
Yeah. So I think if I was going to start to say the micro principle, it's like, if you want to work out more, you should go be roommates with Jackson. That's the best way to work out more. And people's intuition is not to do that. People's intuition is to like buy like a Peloton subscription. And it turns out that doesn't really work. But if you're a roommate with Jackson, you're damn sure you're going to be doing squats and crunches all the time. And so this is sort of the principle. And so if you sort of like ask the question and zoom out a bit, and you're like, how you design your physical environment to sort of reflect that principle, you'd come to something like the projects that me and Kristen have sort of done. And so the first one we did was was something called RGB, which has been going for 6 or 7 years now. And it was our like move in together as a couple moment. And we moved into a 9-bedroom Victorian mansion in the middle of San Francisco, and sort of had the best time of our lives there. And so the setup there is you have 9 bedrooms, but the key design principle is that there's a whole lot of like communal space. And so we picked a place where like the kitchen was really big and nice. The living room was really big and nice. And the spaces are like, you have to walk through those spaces to like get in and out of the door. And what that means is you're having social interaction, sort of very light social interaction with people you love every single day, just as you go about your business. I think a lot of developers of like fancy apartment buildings make a mistake here, which is they tend to put like the nice communal space on the roof. So you get these like rooftop decks with like gardens and stuff. And like, if you ever lived in one of these buildings before, those spaces are actually not very used. And the reason is they're not on your way to anything. Like you have to like go up there to use them. Put the like communal space, like force people into it. Like, and this is designing the environment is like, if you want interactions with people, like design the space so it forces interactions with people. And so that's sort of a principle. So that was sort of our first project. It's like the easiest project to get off the ground. For the next one, we decided to take on one that was a bit more challenging, and that's where I live right now, which is Radish. RGB was great, and I think we would have lived there forever, but we realized that people change, and specifically the change that tends to happen to people in their 30s is they start partnering up and wanting to have kids. And we knew that like this like 9-bedroom mansion in San Francisco was probably not going to be a good fit for that life change. And so we worked on sort of starting like the next community for the next phase of life, which is one where that we sort of is like a transition point between like single people in the city to partnering up to having kids. And we want to be able to accommodate all of them because our friends were sort of, in all those buckets all at once. And so we this time bought a property in Oakland called Radish, and Radish is a 5 building sort of property or set of properties where we have sort of different unit types that like fit well for different stages of life. And so we have a building that's actually sort of like a traditional co-living. You live in a bedroom, you share a bathroom. It's not that expensive. And that's great for like, single people and couples who like don't have kids yet. But we also have some apartment buildings that are like standalone kitchen and their own bathroom and just like an apartment unit you rent also on the property. And that's great if you're coupling up, having kids, having a family. And so now we have a property that can sort of accommodate our friends in these different life stages at the same time. And we can have, and we just had our first 3 kids at Radish. Actually, my partner, Chris, and I just have a 2-month-old now. And it's been so great just like walking into our communal space, dumping the kid on the couch and being like, who wants to watch her? And there's always a taker. And I think we like both benefit from that interaction. I think what's cool about like Radish, so we just had a write-up in the New York Times. This is a profile done of one of our residents. The reporter came to and stayed at Radish. And she called the Radish a luxury commune, which we all found really funny. We were laughing our asses off. And the truth is we actually pay below market rent here. But we have this like big hot tub and fire pit and sauna and all this stuff in this like dedicated communal building. And the math is simple. You can have all this stuff if you share it. And if you don't share it, you don't get any of it. And so we sort of chose the latter.
Yeah, we talk in Cabin a lot, not just about economies of scale, but like vibes of scale. And it looks like
yes.
you two you're achieving both. So many questions that we could get into, and I've asked you plenty of them offline already, but I'm curious, what are some behavioral insights that you've picked up while living with people who come from different walks of life and are in different potential life stages? Like, how do you live together and keep the place clean and orderly and like functioning, especially since like you could potentially have these collective action problems where if everyone's like a co-owner who's going to like take the lead on like taking out the trash or something like that.
Yeah. It's like, how do you turn the tragedy of the commons into the comedy of the commons? It's sort of the game we're playing here. And it's possible. I think there's been like a few surprises for me. And so I think the first one is like, I never been exposed to this kind of living before. And so like my model for this was like a frat house. And I'm like, frat houses are disgusting. There's beer all over the floor. Da, da, da. And it turns out like that is mostly a vestige of the fact that they're like, 18-year-old boys in a frat house. Mm-hmm. And I was once one. But like, what we're doing here is not like a group of 18-year-old boys in college. It's a very different thing. And so I think like adults living together is like very different sort of thing. So that's maybe the first insight is like, banish the notion of the frat house. It's like, does not look like that. The second one is maybe introverts. And so I'm an introvert. I come from a family of introverts. And I'm like, oh God, I don't want to be in a place with a bunch of people if I'm an introvert. I'm going to have to talk to them all the time. It turns out, like, very surprisingly, the introverts like communal living more than the extroverts. And I think the reason for this is introverts actually, it's not that they don't want to talk to people. It's that they don't want to be sort of like, have to be like on socially all the time. And with people you like live with and see every day, like you just don't have to be on with them all the time. It's like, you can sort of tell like that person's walking through the kitchen and get their Cheerios and they don't want to talk to me. And I don't want to talk to them. I got work to do. And you sort of develop this like spidey sense of like how you interact with people once you spend a lot of time with them. And the introverts really know how to navigate that and like actually really like it. But it means that, if I do want social interaction, it's like really available to me and I can just go get it on demand, but not have to get it when I don't want it. So it's sort of the introverts love this was the second surprise. The third one, and this is Kristen's great behavioral insight, is bragging. So we have a cultural norm in our society against bragging. And there's this like idea that you should be the silent hero. And if you do the dishes, the thing you should do is you should do it and not tell anyone. And you just did it because you were supposed to do it. Kristen would say that this is a shitty behavioral norm because what it does is no one sees the work that everyone else is doing. And what you actually want to do is you want to expose other people's contributions because it influences people to contribute more themselves. And if people are in an environment with other people contributing, they want to contribute. We like Homo sapiens like basically imitating each other. we're mimicking species, and if we see contribution, we do contribution. And so the best thing you can do is actually give people ways to brag about the work they are doing. And a way that we do that is we have a Slack channel called Bilbo Braggins, and people can brag that they did the dishes or took out the trash or whatever the sort of the menial chores are, and you can see all the work that people are doing for you, and it motivates you to do the work back and pay it forward.
So those tactics are super helpful and are ones that I think would have served me and my friends well in our co-living projects that we've experimented with over the last 2 years. We now, like, you know, you have the Substack that you write at Super Nuclear. Had I had access to this resource 2 years ago, it would have saved me a lot of headaches. What advice do you have for people looking to start something like Radish or like RGB?
Yeah. So, you know, the most important step is getting started. And the way to get started is to announce that you're getting started publicly. And I think the thing that we've been surprised by is, like, if you plant the flag, people will rally to the flag. And it's not necessarily the people you expect or the people you know. And so both Radish and RGB ended up being filled by people that, like, we would not have thought would have been involved in the project when we started them. And a lot of people that we actually didn't even know. It was people that were like referrals from friends who were like, hey, I can't do this, but my friend would be great for this. And so I think the mistake that people make is they think that if they want to start like a 10-person community, they need to go first find the 10 people. That is not the way to go about this. And in fact, that will stall you because 10 people are not going to agree to anything up front. You want to get like 1 or 2 or 3 people who are very aligned, plant the flag, say, here's what we're doing, here's what it's going to look like, who's in, and people will start rallying to that message. And so we wrote a Google Doc called The Obvious Truth, where we said the obvious truth is you want to be surrounded by people you love and admire. You can find it on our Substack. But something like that, I think, is the way to start. It's not get all the people and then go. That's a recipe for stalling out.
Last question, and then we're going to talk about Cabin for a second. Why is this not the standard? How can we get away from this frat house association, or, you know, when I've done this, we've been called a cult. Like, how can we get rid of any stigma associated with commune-esque living to make co-living and communal living more commonplace, such that others will reap the social, physical, nutritional, and many other benefits that you've had?
Totally. There's a cultural thing, which you said, but I think the first thing is it's just really hard. I don't want to sugarcoat it. Like, starting a community is a lot of work, and will continue to be a lot of work even after you've started it. It pays off. Like, it is paid off richly, but, like, you know, making no mistake. And so I think we need to make this easier on people. And, like, part of the reason Jillian and I write Super Nuclear is we want to give people templates to make this as easy as possible and, like, not make the dumb mistakes that we did. But then there's the cultural aspect. And I think we've had, like, you know, 5 decades of sort of like atomic individualism, where, like, the definition of success is you have your big house with a fence and your 2 cars and your, you know, granite countertops. That's what success is. And I think we just need a new definition of success. For me, it's like the richness of your life. That's success. And I think living like this will put you in a much better position to deliver on the richness of your life than, you know, anything you can buy for your home. So I don't know how that changes. I think we're seeing a change. I think culturally I'm seeing a shift here. This is getting more interest. And I think the pandemic may have helped. I think it, like, shook up people's living situations in a useful way. But I'd love to see more of it, and you know, very happy to support folks that have this vision. Please reach out.
The last thing I'll say just on co-living is that I've seen it work quite well to this idea of, like, planting the flag. When you plant the flag, to have almost a thematic piece to it. So,
yes.
Like, I've done co-living houses organized around, like, very intentional creativity. Like, if you're going to stay here for this 45-day period, like, we are making stuff. We're shipping songs and paintings and poems, like, every day, and, like, that's why you're coming here. And then I've done others that are, like, more fitness oriented, or like, you know, there's 1,000 different themes you could do, and so that's my 2 cents. But
Jackson, what's been your favorite co-living experience?
Well, my favorite was, it was called the Co-Creation Castle. There were 35 of us staying in a 2-house compound in San Diego in January of 2021 and a little bit into February. It was just an Airbnb that like we found and rented, and this was pre-vaccine. And so the 35 people who coalesced, for many of them, it was their, including me, it was the first time spending any reasonable amount of time with someone indoors for such a sustained period. And we had all kinds of crazy safety precautions in place in order to make this happen. So like we had rolling arrival times, we had to wear masks inside nonstop until like 3 days later, where you would test out, and then it was kind of like getting your college admissions letter, but instead of like getting into Stanford or whatever, it's you are COVID free, and so you can mask off. And eventually everyone was maskless. We had all of our groceries delivered. No one was allowed to go anywhere indoors outside of the compound unless they risked the entire group. And it was really like high stakes, but we were super serious about the COVID precautions, and place a lot of trust in strangers, because like there are a lot of people who helped to make it happen, but you were inevitably meeting people you didn't know, and so it was trust in strangers, and that trust, I think, enabled this really unique period of time that could probably never be replicated, because like the early COVID days, probably like I don't know if we'll see something exactly like that again. And even if they did, like co-living models have totally changed such that like that unique month is very special.
Kristen's gonna love the behavioral science of like people taking off their masks as like the initiation ceremony, and then they're in the club.
I have a video. I'll send you some stuff. But and so like I said, like that was very creation themed. Like we had workshops and daily things happening in order to like curate programming for others. But then like the next month, a group of 13 of us, largely from that first house, then went to Hawaii, which had its own COVID things where we had to like isolate in a bubble for 3 days and then like graduate into our house. But that was much more like, you know, we're just in Hawaii and we're just going to go on adventures to waterfalls every day. And like, that's the theme. So
awesome.
As we approach close, maybe 5 to 7 minutes of cabin discussion here, you know, Culdesac seems like it's just getting started in that, like, you know, development's underway. And I'm sure the Tempe property is the first in probably many that Ryan and the team have a vision for. Your beloved and your RGP and Radish and Cloudside circles, like, why is cabin the right place for you to be focusing your city building efforts right now? And also, like, maybe you can share with the audience, because it's their first time meeting you, what your role is at Cabin.
Yeah. So I'm super excited about Cabin. And I'm now working full-time at Cabin. And maybe I'll just sort of start with how that even came to be. So for the folks that don't know, Cabin is a DAO that's building a decentralized city. And I'll talk about what it means in a second. But it's just the story of how I joined. I found Cabin on Twitter, joined Cabin's Discord, just to see what all this like DAO stuff was about. I didn't really, it was my first Discord I ever joined. I didn't really know what DAOs were. And I saw that there was like an invitation basically to propose your own role within Cabin. And so I'm like, sure, I'll give it a shot. And so I proposed a role for myself to a bunch of strangers on the internet and was like, I want to do this role in Cabin called being the placemaker. Here's my responsibilities. Here's what I'll deliver. And here's my compensation request. And I had this like totally like eye-opening moment of having complete strangers on the internet like vote in my role and start to compensate me for my work. Jackson, I don't know if you voted yes or no on me, but we don't have to get into it.
I voted hell yes.
Hell yes. But I'm like, whoa, this is different. I've never gone on a job like this before. So that was my intro to Cabin. But so Cabin is building a decentralized city for independent creators online. And what that means is it's a network of physical locations that we call neighborhoods that are sort of linked by a common culture, a common identity, and a common economy. And so, you know, maybe to sort of do an analogy, you might think about this like Chinatowns in the U.S. So like a lot of major U.S. cities have a Chinatown. The Chinatown is at the same time part of the city, but sort of its own thing. They're distributed all over the U.S. And if you go from one to the other, you'll find sort of a like common like design language, identity, sense of culture in these places. and they have a like an economy that sort of cycles between them. So people go to work at one restaurant in New York Chinatown, then another restaurant in DC Chinatown, and so on. So Cabin's sort of creating like an analog to that, but for people that earn their living on the internet. I think what excites me about Cabin is it's leveraging like the big technology of our times, which is the internet, to sort of create this thing that we're lacking, which is like community and sense of belonging. You sort of see this like scolding meme with like baby boomers where they'll say like, you know, bad on you, Jackson. You don't know your neighbors. Like, get off your phone and meet your neighbors. And like, why don't you know your neighbors? And I sort of think that's bullshit. And the reason is because like it sort of is. I think it's putting a lot on the person to like do this thing, whereas I think the environment should make it easy for people to do this thing. The environment should make it really easy for us to meet our neighbors, and Cabin's going to hopefully do that. And so what we're trying to do is we're getting people that have shared interest and affinity into a online community where they can meet and get to know each other and sort of build connection and trust. And then we're like taking those people and having them then have offline interactions in these like physical neighborhoods that are part of Cabin's network. And so you can go to a writer's retreat, you can go to a creative retreat, you can go to a build a week where you like learn how to like build things. We built a pergola, we built a sauna at one of our neighborhoods a few weeks ago, and a bunch of people just like flew in to help build things together, and they had a lot of fun. No one got paid for it. We just wanted to do it together. And so we sort of have this theory of like this like, you know, online community turning into this like strong offline community, as opposed to like buying a random house and hoping you like your neighbor. Is building a network based on affinity in different places, and you know, and we hope it sort of scales in a way that it like takes advantage of its decentralized nature. And so like, you know, we're looking for existing properties like Radish to sort of become neighborhoods at Cabin. We're not trying to build everything ourselves, which will be a much slower process.
So in thinking that we're building a network, right? If we think about like network theory, a network is a bunch of different nodes connected together. We used to use the term nodes to talk about different neighborhoods. Now we just call them neighborhoods. But the big theme for this season that started this week and is going for the next 3 months is to focus on neighborhood development. And we have a quest which underscores like how important this is to Cabin and the group of people that are working on that, which includes you. So could you talk a little bit about how the team plans to focus on neighborhood development this season, including like what metrics are important for us to pay attention to as an organization?
Yeah, sure. So we have 2 metrics this season. It's heads in beds and more beds. So those are 5 words that are governing our season right now. And for folks that aren't familiar with the terminology, a season is sort of our version of what like a quarter is. It's like our organizing heartbeat of the organization, last 3 months. So so right now we're in a sort of mode of we want to get these like super unique physical places that are like run and owned and managed by caretakers that want to create like a super interesting, unique thing on a property. And so the people that tend to be Cabin caretakers are people that like look at Airbnb and say, I don't want to put my property on there because that's not the kind of interaction I want to have with someone. I don't want this to be a transactional paid interaction. I want to build a community around my property, and have people return again and again and again and like cook dinner for each other and you know, come and like build something with us. And so we're sort of providing a space where like we can have a different sort of type of interaction, and we're looking for caretakers who are like, you know, proprietors of these like physical spaces that will like sort of nominate their properties to be neighborhoods and Cabin's network. So that's sort of the supply side, you can call it, of our marketplace. And then the demand side, which we call heads and beds, is people that want to have these unique experiences at these places. And they're not looking for like a transactional Airbnb stay. They're looking to actually make like a connection with people on the ground. And so we're going to like spin up events at these places. We're doing an event in August called Cabin Summer in the Sierras, in the most beautiful place in the United States, in my opinion, the Eastern Sierra Nevada mountains, California, near Mount Whitney and Bishop and Mammoth and all these places. And we're going to sort of have a co-living experience there where people stay for a month and work on whatever they're working on together in the mountains with gigabit internet. And so come join for that. You can find that was on the Cabin website. And so that's an example of heads and beds. It's getting people to these programs to like connect and experience and build a relationship with these places.
Hot take about most beautiful spot in the U.S., but I'll have to let you know my take once I go.
You like
Phil,
desert plus mountains? This is desert plus mountains, and those are my two favorite places.
Fair. I have one last question, and Phil will be back on the show plenty of times this season, so for the audience's sake, this will not be the last time you'll be hearing from him. But I was listening to a different podcast the other day, hosted by Eric Torenberg, and he asks this woman, Kat Cole, who's the COO of Athletic Greens, and she's had this incredible career. She went from a hostess to corporate VP from between the ages of like 17 and like 24, something like ridiculously fast, and has just like risen through the ranks of all these different huge corporations. And we're talking about leading with compassion, and she talked about how the best leaders don't have all the answers, but they definitely have all the questions, or at least some of the questions. And so I'm curious for you, Phil, as you think about placemaking in the cabin context and developing neighborhoods, what are the questions that maybe you don't have answers to yet, but might be keeping you up at night?
Yeah. So I think the big one at cabin, and I didn't mention in my description, is, so cabin is utilizing tokens. So we have a Web3 token called Cabin, to sort of like align incentives and align motivation between the participants in this network. So Cabin's going to be owned by its neighborhoods and the residents of these neighborhoods. It's not owned by external investors. And so I think one of the open questions is like, what sort of behaviors does like ownership by the participants result in? And I think in like the Web3 universe, there's a lot of optimism that this will be a better world. And I would actually like, maybe put more humility on that question if versus what I see on Twitter a lot, which is like, it's going to be different than how a Web2 company works and how Web2 ownership structure works. But I think it's going to come with its own set of challenges and probably downsides as well. And I think we need to be eyes open to that. So it's like what are sort of the motivational behavioral outcomes of this like token ownership by community? And I think we're going to find this out over time.
I am excited to learn that alongside you, Phil. Thank you so much for joining the show. For folks who want to learn more about co-living, you can subscribe to Phil's newsletter at supernuclear.substack.com that he writes with his friend Jillian. Phil, thanks so much for coming, and can't wait to have you back.
Thanks, Jackson. This was fun.